Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's session, The Future of Authentication. I'm Sarah Peters, an editor with Dark Reading, a cybersecurity publication, and we have a wonderful panel for you today with a combination of technological innovators in the authentication industry and some enterprise security professionals who are tackling the identity management challenges every day. So I'd like to introduce them to you now. We have, when I introduce you, gentlemen, just give a little wave so everybody knows which one you are. We have Bassam Al-Khalidi from Axiad. He's co-CEO of Axiad. Welcome. We have Fred Kwong, the Chief Information Security Officer from Delta Dental. Welcome, Fred. We have David Levine, the VP and Corporate and Information Security at Rico USA. And Eric Brown, the Senior Manager of Enterprise and Identity and Access Management at SAIC. Welcome, Eric. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And note to the audience that if you want to know even more about these fine people, you can see their complete bios on the Interop site. So everyone, I would like you all to answer our very first question, which is, in a perfect world, which we are not in, but let's pretend that we are, in a perfect world, what would authentication look like? What does it achieve? What's the experience like for users, et cetera, et cetera? Bassam, you're up first. What do you say? What's your favorite kind of authentication?
Sarah, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to the rest of the panel for joining today and for really tackling this subject. I think unfortunately there is no one silver bullet when we talk about authentication. I think the reality of authentication today is there's different authentication schemes and different methods depending on what you're trying to access. But I think from a high level perspective, where do we want to be, in the future is we want to be able to authenticate in a seamless, continuous way to access the information that we need and to safeguard that information from a security perspective and a privacy perspective. And I think that's where we'd love to see where the future of authentication, where it goes. Today, obviously, there's still a lot to get there, but we're making great strides towards that. But I think from my perspective, I think that's really what we'd love to get to, is make it simple, secure, seamless, and make sure that the privacy aspect of it is still there.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads as you're giving that answer. So Eric, I'll send it to you next.
Sure, and again, thank you as well for having me here. I think one of the main challenges that Bassam pointed out is very clear. It is about the seamless authentication for our users. We need to make sure that everything remains secure, but is also simple and intuitive for the user to use. And I think that is probably the nirvana, is something that's easy, fast, and secure all at the same time.
Good stuff. David, how about you?
Yeah, so it's tough to add to that. I'm happy to be here, but yeah, I think that's really the key piece, right? I mean, we got to make it easy for our end users. Anytime, particularly in this space, when we come up with something new that, from a security perspective makes sense to us. We also have to be mindful about how that impacts their user experience. So I think the cinch pin here is having that seamless good user experience, but from our internal perspective, from a security perspective, of course, it's got to be reliable and accurate, and ensure that we're validating that people or assets are who they purport to be.
Okay, Fred, bring us home. Anything that they missed?
I don't really think so. I think the team pretty much covered it. I'll speak to it in the other way and just say, what it is in the future, right? The world that we would like to live in is one that is definitely passwordless. We've known that passwords has been a challenge for our user community for quite some time, and we know it's not part of the future. So, biometrics, risk-based authentication, I could throw in a few more buzzwords there, but the reality is it is something that is not heaped on the existing security stack of the password today.
Okay, well, before we talk about passwordless authentication, because we're definitely going to, I want you to pick up on what you just said, Fred, because next week is actually World Password Day. And unfortunately for passwords, it's not actually a day for them to celebrate because we're generally talking about how to get rid of them. Is there anything that we like about passwords? Is there anything good to keep about them before we move on? So Fred, you're on the spot.
Yeah, I think there's still ways to introduce passwords in a way that are still fairly user-friendly. A lot of organizations have moved to password vaults where you're protecting the vault. And you have these complex lengthy passwords that people don't necessarily need to memorize. But as long as we're doing a different form of multi-factor authentication in terms of the vault and keeping them secure and keeping them separate from password reuse, I believe that there is a way that passwords can live. Those are the pieces that I would like. So things like service accounts where we have long, complex passwords that potentially don't need rotation, moving forward. The ability to crack a 75 plus length password is pretty hard, right? Even with the quantum computing that exists out there. So if we know of and we're able to monitor for precise password and authentication use, then there's probably a place for that still to exist in the future, especially for the non-user, more B2B or C2C type of communication.
Okay. Anybody have anything to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to agree with Fred. Passwords are critical for some of the roles that we see up and coming today. We talk about service accounts, but now we're also talking about RPA, robotic process automation. And that's going to play a huge role where these machines obviously can't have an extra token to either read a passcode from to have MFA. So really having those password vaults and tight integration to the applications is where I think the password use case is going to remain. But for our standard users, that's where we're looking to the future.
Great point. However, most people are still thinking about how can I get rid of all of these passwords? And we've been talking a lot for a very long time about this passwordless world and passwordless authentication, but we're not there yet. So why not? What is preventing us from getting to that passwordless world? Bassam, I'll send that one to you first.
Yeah, I think the main issue is if we go back a little bit, before we had the perimeter was simple, is everything that was inside the organization. Then that perimeter grow and it became, okay, well, it's everything inside the organization and people that would remote VPN in. And then, with cloud computing, it became everywhere. And now with the current state of affairs, with everyone pretty much working remote, now it became everywhere, everything, all the time, right? And that expansion of remote access and remote work became so much bigger. Then you add on top of that, we talked a lot. We always talk about user authentication, but it's actually the problem has gone beyond that. It's user authentication, it's machine-to-machine authentication, it's application-to-application authentication, cloud-to-cloud authentication, right? So when we look at all these different elements trying to authenticate together, it's great that sometimes we talk to organizations and they say, hey, we're going to lock down all our VPN. Well, it's great. Yeah, we put a vault at the door, but our windows are still open. So that's something we always kind of talk about is how can we look at a comprehensive authentication scheme. Fred alluded to some of it, right? So we want to ensure we lock down our key service accounts, right? Make sure there's a lot of different great password vault solutions, right? We want to have that. Eric alluded to, like, we want to make sure users are authenticating with some type of MFA, right? David was also talking about, well, we still need applications to authenticate. So it's really having all these different elements. Then you add on top of it that where there is not a global unified backend directory for enterprise, and I'm not talking about just the typical LDAP or the typical directly. We're talking applications that are siloed. They have their own authentication scheme. They have their own authentication backend or database. And now companies have to struggle with that, right? So I have to authenticate my users when they authenticate through the VPN. That's one form of authentication. I have to also do it when they authenticate to the endpoints. I got to do it when they authenticate to cloud applications that are not integrated within my environment, because it's something we had to spin up quickly, and because of the current situation. So it just makes the picture a lot more complex. And then also David mentioned it. What happens is we start to make it more complex for the end user. Why? Because they have all these different authentication schemes and methods at different areas. That's not where we want to be. What we want to be is, how can we simplify the passwordless journey to our users, to our devices, to our machines? How do we simplify that journey? How do we make it seamless to the end user, where they can authenticate regardless what resource they're trying to access in a secure way, but not at the sacrifice of security? Typically, when we hear the word security, it means we're going to make it more complex to the end user. There's always this line of we can make it more complex for the user, or simplicity means less security. Well, we need to find the perfect intersect, which is the right amount of simplification with the right amount of security, and that intersect is really hard to find sometimes, depending on where the organization is at in their passwordless journey.
Whew, there's a lot to unpack there. I asked, what are the obstacles to passwordless authentication? And it sounds like there are a lot of them. So David, let me bring you back in here. One of the last things that Bassam was saying there was about the fact that usability of security is a main obstacle for a lot of security, but specifically with authentication. Would you list that high among the reasons that, among the obstacles, or what else would you put on that list?
Oh, absolutely. I put that towards the top. I mean, I think, again, that's always key. I mean, so what happens is when you make it difficult or frustrating for users, then they try and come up with workarounds, right? And they do silly things like write passwords down and share passwords and do all kinds of crazy things that all makes us, nuts and makes our jobs difficult. But that's because a lot of the times we haven't made it easy for them. Another thing, though, that I would definitely throw on that list, though, is if we want to get there with passwordless, there's a whole lot of stuff that has to move with that. So take a look at all the certifications out there, right? Whether you're doing HIPAA, HITRUST, ISO, pick one, any of them, they're all most of them are still ensconced in that traditional, password type methodology. And our customers, I know for us, like my peers here, I'm sure, we're all busy answering security questionnaires from a third-party risk perspective. I have not seen one yet, and we get them from, the Fortune 50. I have not seen one yet that still wasn't asking the most fundamental, basic, password length. How long are you, rotating them? Are you requiring special characters? I mean, that's part of that equation too. All that stuff has got to move along with that whole journey to get there. So there's got to be standardization, there's got to be usability and reliability, and you have to get some kind of momentum going with people accepting it. Otherwise, you're gonna get into situations where today people go, well, hey, I'd love to do it, but I can't because of this particular requirement, whether it be a regulation or a standard.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about, when you're talking about authentication and workarounds, there's really two different, probably more than two, but there are two different kind of parallel avenues that I think about. I think of what people are going to be forced to use as employees at, for internal use in their organization. And then I think about your customers who might just be deciding whether or not they're going to bother logging in to use your website and buy something on your site, for example. Do you treat those, and if so, how do you treat those differently? Is the pathway to innovating in identity management and authentication different for those two different things? And Fred, you're on the spot for that one first.
Oh, well, thanks for the easy one here, Sarah.
Well,
I think the answer is
it's actually a pretty easy answer in the sense that it really depends on the risk your organization is willing to accept, right? So obviously, and maybe I shouldn't say obviously, if you're protecting a privileged type account, right, you're going to want to make the barrier to entry a little bit harder, right, than potentially a customer account, right, which you want them to get involved into your application or your system, right, that will help them help themselves. So the biggest challenge really is not necessarily the learning curve aspect, but I think it's more on the technical debt that most organizations have. If you think about things like mainframe, mainframe was supposed to be dead 50 years ago. It's still alive, it's still churning, and anyone that supports a mainframe knows that OAuth authentication, single sign-on, right? So right away, you already have these barriers that are preventing you from moving to that nirvana, right? And so our customers, though, on the flip side, right, a lot of them have iPhones or Samsung phones, right? And you're doing face recognition and you're doing biometrics, right? And so from a customer perspective, they're used to this newer authentication type technology. And the more that it broadens out and more that proliferates, right, the easier it is going to be for us as companies to support that kind of moving forward. But at the same time, you still have this pretty large age gap as well in terms of the adoption of that technology, right? And so you have to care for both of those concepts at the same time. So while you're still providing those newer biometric or authentication mechanisms, you still have to care for some of the folks that aren't into that technology, right? And just want a good old-fashioned way to get into the system without having these having to have new cell phones or just having that simple kind of password, and leaving it up to the customer to then determine, if they want to put MFA in front of that and accept the risk associated with it. It could be something as simple as, hey, I have a rewards point for, my local arcade or something like that. So, maybe we don't put a lot of effort into protecting that. But, if it's my, financial bank account, then, the effort might be, hey, I want to be able to support even up to YubiKeys, right? To have that additional layer of security and what makes me comfortable as a customer.
Anyone else want to add to that before I move on?
Yeah, I think I'd like to kind of sum up quite a few things. The first one is standardization is probably one of the biggest hurdles that we're facing today. Fred made a point of calling out, older technologies that we cannot standardize to a newer authentication framework. We have applications that are still stuck in their old ways of doing it for whatever reason, local authentication versus moving to more accepted forms, open frameworks, OpenID, OAuth, SAML. Those are all some stepping stones to getting to authentication. But I think the key along with those is escalation. I think that plays a really big role in how we manage authentication. For example, you want to go see the balances on your bank account. Well, yeah, a simple biometric or a PIN, you can get in and view your balances. Now, you want to do a transaction, well, let's verify your password again, just to make sure that you are who you say you are. You want to trade $1 million in stocks, well, let's verify you once more, a little bit more difficult. And now you have escalation that's built into the authentication framework. And I think all those can be served with different forms of whether it's passwords, pins, biometrics, combination of multi-factors, so more than one of these factors would play a vital role. And I think that's where we need to be headed as an industry as we move forward to get to passwordless.
Every time you guys answer a question, I think of 15 more questions to ask. But I actually want to go back a little bit to something that Eric said, I think it was Eric said earlier, about machine identities, because obviously we've been talking a lot about authenticating people and the friction involved in that, but particularly recently, as we've been sending people home and we're having to deal with all of these unknown endpoint devices, and just with the proliferation of IoT devices, we have more and more machine identities to have to deal with. So, well, number one, am I just reaching there and creating saying that there's a problem that there isn't? Or is that a problem that is complicating matters for identity management? And Eric, since you said something that made me think of it, you're on the spot first.
Sure, and actually that is a problem that is real. We have new types of accounts that need to be leveraged today than we did, even 5 years ago. Robotic process automation wasn't in the picture 5 years ago; it was just emerging. Now we have these RPA bots that can perform regular functions the same way as a human could, but they are required to, abide by user rules, which in a lot of cases, as we move forward in the industry with MFA, make it difficult. So we need to find new innovative ways to authenticate those types of accounts. And we're dealing with that today. Do we use a service type account? Do we use a standard user account? Which one gives too broad access? How do we effectively monitor those accounts to make sure that someone is not exploiting them? So there's a lot under the covers when we talk about machine accounts that need to be kept in mind. And those are definitely barriers to moving forward on the passwordless journey. It may turn out that it bifurcates and has users branching off into passwordless and machine accounts branching off into some other newer technology that we haven't even thought of yet, whether it's certificates or combination of certificates with a PIN that can be stored within the system. So there's a lot of things to uncover there.
Anyone else want to comment on that before I move on?
Yeah,
Sure. Yeah.
Everybody.
Go ahead.
Okay, Bassam, you're up first. Go for it.
I think Sarah wanted to kind of really make a quick comment on what you stated, that you're not overreaching. I think the business problem that we have right now, especially when we talk about enterprise IoT, we have to protect multiple avenues, but from an authentication perspective, not only do we have to authenticate, as Eric was mentioning, kind of the service accounts or the automated accounts, but it's also critical that we authenticate the device itself to the network. The reason why it's so critical to authenticate the device itself to the network, as Fred mentioned, we're moving to enterprise has moved to kind of iOS, Android devices. These devices are connected all the time, every time, right? This is a hacker's dream to get access to a device that's on all the time, every time. So I think it's as important, it's as critical for enterprise to look at this is this user authorized to get access to this resource? That's a critical item. It's as critical now, is this device allowed to be on my network? Right, and where the challenge becomes even greater for enterprise is it's easier when we say it's a device managed by the organization, but when we open it up to BYOD, it becomes even a more exciting challenge.
Got it, David. I felt like you were itching to add to that, so go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to layer on a little bit and completely agree with everything that's been said. But the other problem we have too is that when it comes to IoT, particularly smaller type, less sophisticated IoT devices, we still have the problem today that a lot of them just don't even have the capability and the mechanisms to do authentication. they don't have the configurability, or worse of all, they're hardwired with that kind of information. And so I think we're making strides, in that area. There's more heat and light on this subject because we're seeing more issues out there, but there's still a ways to go in that regard. And on top of that, and again, I think this kind of ties into what was already said, but just from my viewpoint, at Rico, we sell a lot of devices, right? And I can't tell you how many times, and I'm surprised, where we have clients that still don't always necessarily look at that device in the way they should. And today a multifunction printer is a computer on your network, basically, with access to all kinds of stuff. And like anything else, it's got to be set up and configured appropriately. And it's just surprising how today still, some people go, it's the copier. Well, yes, but so that ties into all of that too, and authentication is a piece of that as well.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our time here. So there's a question I want a yes or no answer to it before we get into any deeper into that answer. And all of you are going to give me a yes or no. Maybe you can give me a maybe. So Bassam, you're first. Is the identity the new perimeter?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Fred?
It is one of two, I see.
Ooh, that's cryptic. Okay, David?
Yeah, I'm gonna for the ease of conversation, I'm gonna say yes. It's definitely there.
Okay, Eric?
I'm going to have to agree with everybody else. Absolutely.
Okay, Fred, you have to tell us what's the other one.
APIs is the other new perimeter, if you ask me. Those are the two areas that we're going to see a lot of growth in, and we're going to continue to see growth, and we're going to need to do better governance across those things. When my counterparts across the board have touched on this, but when you think about authentication, are we able to see who's authenticating, from where they're authenticating? Does it match up from the behavior that we expect from that authentication? And are they requesting the right access through that authentication, right? That visibility is going to be something that we're going to really want to continue to shine the light on, not only around the identity, but then also around our APIs as well. And those are definitely the two areas where, the old perimeters are definitely legacy at this point in the game.
You just really quickly, you mentioned the word governance, which is one we haven't said that much, but it does seem like identity governance is an identity management and authentication. They're all kind of pieces of the same puzzle, but are you generally treating them together, or are different teams handling all of those things?
Yeah, I would actually, let me rephrase and say, when we think about governance and identities, we're really talking about the identity lifecycle, right? From start to finish, where does that identity first get created to how does it end at the end, right? In terms of deletion or disabling or whatever the case may be. And we as a security technology organization, right, that and other companies really need to kind of focus on that whole life cycle of that identity and making sure that we have the spotlight in each area as that identity continues through its process, that we're able to see who's making that change, who's authorizing it, right, or whatever the case may be, kind of moving through that cycle.
All right, we're just about to the end of our time together here, everyone. So in 1 minute, I'm going to ask all of you, can you give your major pieces of advice to the audience who's watching? When they leave today, is there 1 or 2 steps that they can take to just improve their authentication and identity management? I know that you don't need to fix it, but what is step 1? Bassam, going to you first.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer in 1 minute, because there's a lot to unpack. But I would say I wouldn't burden the enterprise to try to find. I mentioned this before, finding that silver bullet of authentication across the enterprise. You know, going to say, hey, we're going to have everyone authenticate via mobile. I think it's great. We live in a mobile world, but again, mobile is not the silver bullet. What happens when my battery is dead on my phone? What happens when I lose it? How do I do identity proofing in day one? I think you need to have a flexible plan or a flexible platform or a flexible project that you can meet my privileged accounts, my privileged users. How do I secure not only my day-to-day interaction with my endpoint, with my handheld, with my laptop, or with a portal, but also how do I secure the other elements of the enterprise and not create a new can of worms by having different silo products to secure different areas of the enterprise. Because what that will do is we're patching one problem and creating another problem on the other side. So concretely, what do I mean by that? I mean, we would recommend for enterprise to look at how can I solve these different authentication problems, these different authentication schemes with a turnkey, simple platform that if I have to secure my APIs, I can do that. If I want to secure my endpoints that are connected to my network, I could do that. If I can secure my privileged access users and my regular users and my contractors, I could do that. I think I'm running out of time here, but that's what I would recommend.
Okay. So you want something that gives people options. Eric, you're next.
I'm going to say the best advice I could give is find a framework that works for your organization and standardize on it. And as you're rolling it out, listen to your users. The last thing you want is for the users to start working around the security you're putting in place by doing bad habits, writing passwords down, sharing credentials, as David pointed out. You don't want them doing that. So create your standard and then listen to your users, get the feedback, and find a way to incorporate that feedback into a more secure solution.
I like it. Good stuff. David?
Sure, I'll add a couple of other twists in there, I think, to add that into the formula here. I would say, make sure your bases are covered. Make sure you've got the foundations in place already and that you're doing the right kinds of things around, access, rights, or people have access to what they should, not too much access, and that you're following the basic things you have in place. And the other piece I layer in there is make sure you take a risk-based approach. I mean, if authentication is a huge area, so look for those areas that are the riskiest for your company and for what you do, and then start there. Don't try and boil the ocean. Start with the highest risk area and work your way down from there.
Good stuff. Okay, Fred, bring us home.
I'll take a little bit of a twist again, just looking at it from a risk perspective to your organization. Probably the number one thing that you can do in this space to reduce risk to your organization is number one, implement MFA on your external access wherever possible. And then number two is try to get people away from the password and start using passphrases kind of moving forward.
Good stuff. All right, everyone. Well, listen, it has been a pleasure having all of you here. I think everyone has learned a lot. If they have been paying attention, I know that I have learned a lot myself. Thank you again. That is all the time that we have had today. Bassam Al-Khalidi, Eric Brown, Fred Kwong, David Levine, and of course, to all of you in the audience, we would not and could not do this without you. Once again, I am Sarah Peters on behalf of Dark Reading and Interop. Please stay safe out there and have a great day.